They were lost. That was all it was at the beginning. Joan Rogers and her daughters Michelle and Christie had been driving through Tampa and had gotten turned around, and they needed directions to their motel. They were on their first family vacation. They had driven down from Wilshire, Ohio, a small farming community in Van Wert County, the kind of place where the nearest city feels like a different world, and a trip to Florida represents something significant, something planned and saved for and anticipated, to visit Walt Disney World. And they were making their way back through Tampa, and they were lost, and they stopped to ask a man for help. The man's name was Oba Chandler. He gave them directions. He also gave them something else, a tourist brochure for the area with notes written on it in his own hand. He pointed them toward their motel. He did something else too. He charmed them. He told them about the sunset over Tampa Bay from the water. He told them it was something you couldn't see from land. He told them he had a boat. He told them he'd take them out and show them. Joan Rogers had a husband at home, Hal, who had stayed behind to tend the dairy farm. She had 2 daughters. She was 36 years old on her first real vacation, and she said yes. They boarded his boat, the Gypsy one, on the evening of June 1st, 1989. The 3 of them and Oba Chandler on the water at sunset. What happened after that is known now in the way that things become known after years of investigation, trial testimony, phone records, and physical evidence. What is known is that Joan Rogers and her daughters, Michelle and Christie, never returned to shore alive. On June 4th, 1989, 3 days after they boarded the boat, their bodies were found floating in Tampa Bay. Each had yellow polypropylene rope tied around her neck. The other end of each rope was tied to a concrete block. Their hands and feet were bound with duct tape. Their mouths were taped shut, but their eyes were not. The FBI profile that investigators would later construct around the crime said this was deliberate. The killer wanted them to watch. He wanted to see their terror. Their eyes were left open on purpose. Autopsies determined they had been in the water between 50 and 60 hours. They were nude from the waist down. The length of time in the water made it impossible to determine definitively whether they had been sexually assaulted, though investigators believed they had been. The cause of death was asphyxiation, from the ropes, or from drowning, or both. The medical examiner could not determine which, and it didn't matter to the charge. They were in Tampa Bay with concrete blocks tied to their necks, and they had been there since the night they got on a stranger's boat to watch the sunset. A fisherman spotted them. He called the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard called law enforcement. And at some point that morning, information moved from a Coast Guard dispatch in Tampa Bay to a police department in Ohio to a road that ran past a dairy farm in Wilshire, where Hal Rogers was working. And then someone drove to the farm and got out of a car and told him that his wife and daughters had been found floating in Tampa Bay. Hal Rogers was at home in Ohio when police came to tell him. He had been tending the dairy farm. He had stayed behind because someone had to, because the cows didn't take vacations, and because the farm was the family's livelihood, and because Joan had said she and the girls would make the trip without him, just this once, and he had agreed. Joan had taken the girls and made the trip they had been planning, the trip to Disney World, and Hal was at home with the animals and the work and the ordinary rhythms of a dairy farm in Wilshire, Ohio. And when the police came to his door, he became the surviving member of a family that had gone on vacation and not come home. His wife and both daughters, gone in one night on a stranger's boat on the water. He would spend the next 22 years of his life waiting for something to happen to the man who had done this. A Pulitzer Prize-winning series of articles in the St. Petersburg Times would follow his story across those years. The grief, the waiting, the farm, the quiet persistence of a man who had nothing left to do with his loss except carry it. He would attend the execution wearing a suit and tie, because that was what you wore when the thing you had been waiting for finally happened. But first, there were 3 years during which nobody knew who Oba Chandler was. The investigation began with what it had: 3 bodies, concrete blocks, yellow polypropylene rope, and a tourist brochure found in the Rogers family car when police located it in a boat ramp parking lot 8 days after the murders. The brochure had handwriting on it, notes, directions, the kind of scrawl you produce when you're helping strangers find their motel. The handwriting was the only physical evidence that pointed toward anyone specific. It pointed towards someone. It just didn't yet have a name. Investigators worked the case. They followed leads. In October 1989, a significant development arrived. A Canadian tourist came forward and reported that in May of that year, 2 weeks before the Rogers murders, a man had approached her and a friend on Madeira Beach, invited them onto his boat, taken one of them out into the bay, and raped her. The woman described the attacker. A composite sketch was developed. The sketch looked like someone. The description of the boat matched a description, but the name didn't come. Investigators had a handwriting sample, a composite sketch, and a rape case with a survivor. What they didn't have was the person who connected all three. For 3 years, the case moved forward and went nowhere. Tips came in. Nothing held. The evidence sat. Hal Rogers sat in Ohio waiting for a phone call that didn't come. In 1992, the St. Petersburg Police Department made a decision born of desperation and changed what true crime investigations could look like. They took the handwriting from the tourist brochure, the notes Oba Chandler had written for a family asking for directions to their motel, and they had it enlarged. They put it on 5 billboards across the Tampa Bay area. The question the billboards asked was simple. Do you recognize this handwriting? The decision to use billboards was not obvious or inevitable. It was the product of years of failure, of leads that went nowhere and tips that didn't hold, and a file that kept accumulating without producing an arrest. The investigators working the case had exhausted the standard approaches. They had the handwriting and the composite sketch and the rape survivor's account and the phone records. They had a clear picture of someone. They had no name. In 1992, there was no national DNA database, no genetic genealogy, no technology that could take the biological evidence and generate a family tree. What they had was a piece of paper with a stranger's handwriting on it, recovered from the car of 3 women who were dead. And they decided to put that piece of paper on a billboard and ask an entire city of strangers if anyone recognized it. The billboards went up on July 30th, 1992. The following day, a woman called. She said she had actually reported this weeks earlier when the handwriting sample had appeared in a newspaper. She had faxed something to investigators at the time, but it had apparently not reached the right people. She faxed it again. What she sent was a contract written by a man who had installed aluminum enclosures at her property. An unlicensed contractor who worked around the Tampa Bay area, who went by different names sometimes, who had a boat. His name was Oba Chandler. When the handwriting expert compared the brochure notes to the contract, they matched. When investigators pulled Chandler's criminal record, they found juvenile arrests and adult felony charges for rape, robbery, and kidnapping. When they found the composite sketch of the man who had attacked the Canadian tourist in 1989 and placed it beside a photograph of Oba Chandler, they were looking at the same face. When they moved to arrest him, Chandler was gone. He had left the Tampa area. Investigators tracked him through a network of contacts and eventually located him at a gas station as he was returning to Florida. He was arrested on September 24, 1992. 3 years and 3 months after the Rogers family boarded his boat. Chandler was 45 years old at the time of his arrest. He had been living in the Tampa Bay area for years. He had a wife and a daughter. He worked, or claimed to work, as an aluminum siding contractor, though he had no license and operated under different names in different transactions. His neighbors, by all accounts, knew him as an ordinary man. A man with a boat who knew the water. In the 17 years he would spend on death row between his 1994 conviction and his 2011 execution, he did not receive a single visit from a friend or family member. The trial began in 1994. Against the advice of his attorneys, Oba Chandler took the stand. He admitted meeting Joan Rogers and her daughters. He admitted giving them directions. He admitted writing on the tourist brochure. He said he had never seen them again after pointing them toward their motel. He said he had nothing to do with what happened to them on the water. The prosecution put Judy Blair on the stand. Judy Blair was the Canadian tourist who had been raped by Chandler 2 weeks before the Rogers murders. She described what had happened on the boat. She described how he had charmed her, isolated her, threatened her, and then raped her when she refused him. She described the specific quality of escalation, the way the trip had begun as something ordinary and become something else at the moment he decided it would. The jury heard Judy Blair and then heard the evidence, the handwriting, the phone records placing his boat, the gypsy one, in Tampa Bay during the hours the Rogers family disappeared. The testimony of a boat mechanic who contradicted Chandler's claim that his boat had broken down that night. There was also something else, something that an FBI profiler had noted in the case analysis and that the prosecution made sure the jury understood. The mouths were taped, the eyes were not. That distinction was not accidental. The person who did this had made a specific choice about what the victims would and wouldn't experience. They would not be able to call for help, but they would be able to see. They would be able to watch the water around them, watch the boat moving away, watch the surface of Tampa Bay from below as they were pushed under, and understand what was happening and be unable to change it. That choice, the deliberate, specific choice to leave the eyes uncovered, reflected something specific about the man who made it. Something the FBI profiler characterized as a need to witness terror, not just to cause it, but to see it. The mouths were for his safety. The eyes were for his satisfaction. The jury convicted Oba Chandler in 90 minutes. It took them 30 minutes more to recommend the death penalty. Pinellas Pasco Chief Judge Susan Schaefer, who presided over the case, later described Chandler as probably the vilest, most evil defendant she had ever handled. She imposed the sentence on November 4, 1994. Chandler appealed. He kept appealing. He maintained his innocence across every appeal, every filing, every legal document that bore his name for the next 17 years. His wife, Deborah, filed for divorce shortly after the conviction. In accordance with his ex-wife's wishes, he was not allowed to see photographs of his daughter Whitney as she grew up. He sat in a cell at Florida State Prison and continued to insist that the handwriting had been misidentified, the phone records misread, the witness wrong. Nobody visited him. In the 17 years he spent in the prison system between his 1994 conviction and his 2011 execution, not one friend or family member came to see him. The cell was where Oba Chandler lived out the years between the courtroom and the execution chamber, alone, without the people he had lived among in the Tampa Bay community as an ordinary contractor with a boat, and a series of assumed names and a record that nobody had connected to the thing that was happening in his life. He had worked under different names: Jim Wright, Dave Posner. The alias was practical, the habit of a man who had been arrested before and found it useful to exist at a slight remove from his own identity. He had charmed people with these various names, contracted work with them, dealt with them in the ordinary way of someone building a small and unremarkable business life. The boat was real. The skills were real. The warmth was real enough to work. It had worked in May 1989 with a Canadian tourist who was later raped. It had worked in June 1989 with a family from Ohio who was later killed. In July 2008, Chandler was added to Florida's list of pending executions. Governor Rick Scott signed the death warrant on October 10, 2011. The execution was set for November 15th. Hal Rogers drove to Florida State Prison in Stark in a suit and tie. He sat in the witness room, separated from the execution chamber by glass, and watched the man who had killed his wife and daughters receive a lethal injection at 4:25 in the afternoon. Oba Chandler was 65 years old. He closed his eyes and died, according to the Tampa Bay Times report, in his sleep. He had no final words to speak. Instead, he handed prison officials a handwritten note. It was released to the public after his death. "You are killing an innocent man today," it said. The prosecutor who had helped convict him, Bruce Bartlett, was among the witnesses at the execution. When the note was released, Bartlett read it and said one word: bull. The word innocent appeared in Oba Chandler's own hand on a piece of notebook paper at the end of a 22-year chain of events that had begun with a different piece of handwriting. The directions he had scrawled on a tourist brochure for 3 women who were lost and needed help getting to their motel. It was the handwriting that caught him, the same handwriting that had started everything. 3 years after his execution, in February 2014, investigators in Coral Springs, Florida, announced that cold case DNA testing had linked Oba Chandler to the 1990 murder of Ivelisse Barrios Begaris, a 20-year-old woman who had been abducted from a mall parking lot, strangled, and left in a neighborhood in Broward County. She had been working at a swim sports store in the Sawgrass Mills Mall for less than a month. She finished her shift, went to her car, and found 2 of her tires had been slashed. Someone had been waiting. She was abducted, bound, strangled, and her body was left in a developing area of Coral Springs. Her husband found her car in the parking lot and called police. Her body was found a few hours later. The DNA from the rape kit collected in 1990 had sat untested for years, not because investigators were careless, but because in 1990, the technology to process it correctly didn't exist, and the database into which a processed profile would be entered didn't yet contain Chandler's name. By the time both existed, by the time the technology and the database entry were both present, Chandler had been executed for the Rogers murders and was 3 years in the ground. The Coral Springs detective who made the announcement said something that investigators who study these cases remember. Ivelisse Barrios Begaris did nothing to deserve this. She was picked at random. That word, random, is the part that doesn't resolve. The Rogers family had been lost and had asked for directions. Ivelisse Barrios Begaris had been working and had gone to her car. Both encounters ended the same way. Chandler looked for an opportunity and found one and used it and moved on. Ivelisse Barrios Begaris' family got a press conference and a dead man's name and the knowledge that the system had been 3 years too slow. Oba Chandler had worked as an unlicensed contractor in the Tampa Bay area, on and off, for years before the murders. He had gone by different names in different transactions. He had a boat and knew the water and knew how to make people feel comfortable enough to board his boat and go somewhere they wouldn't have gone with a stranger. He had done it before the Rogers family, and he had done it after. He had been doing something like it his entire adult life. The charm, the false name, the boat, the escalation. And the Rogers family was the moment when the escalation went to its furthest point and left 3 bodies in the water. He had written his own arrest down on a tourist brochure the same afternoon he had introduced himself to the people he was about to kill. He handed it to Joan Rogers as a kindness, a local man helping out-of-state visitors find their way. He handed them the only physical evidence that would ever conclusively connect him to what happened that night. He handed it to them in his own handwriting, and walked away and went on with his life. And 3 years later, that same handwriting appeared on 5 billboards across Tampa Bay, and a neighbor recognized it from a contract he had signed at her property. And his name came to the surface of an ordinary city like something that had been waiting under the water all along. He handed it to them in his own handwriting. And then 3 years later, when the same handwriting appeared on 5 billboards across Tampa Bay and a neighbor recognized it, Chandler's name surfaced from the ordinary landscape of an ordinary man's ordinary life in a city that had never connected him to anything. The judge who sentenced him to death called him the vilest defendant she had ever handled. The man himself, on the last day of his life, insisted in a handwritten note that he was innocent. His handwriting, again, at the end. The same loops and lines that had been enlarged and displayed across Tampa Bay in 1992. The same hand, that had written directions for 3 women who were lost on their first family vacation and needed help finding their motel. His daughter Whitney grew up without photographs of him. He sat in a cell for 17 years and nobody came. Klled Rogers attended the execution in a suit and tie and sat behind glass and watched it happen. The 3 of them, Joan, Michelle, Christie, had gotten lost on the way back from Disney World. They had stopped to ask a man for directions. The man had a boat and told them the sunset was beautiful from the water. They said yes. That was all it took.